as Sean and I were, when we first connected today on our call, Sean was like, this book is such a roller coaster.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad. That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show.
Red versus blue, but this time as a love triangle.
Okay, I'm Sean.
I'm Jen.
And today we're here with Tracy Deonn. Welcome to the show, Tracy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Finally, I'm excited to be here.
We are so excited to have you. Sadly, not for our seaQuest podcast quite yet, but we will get there.
We will. So for folks that don't know who you are, and I would be very suspect at this point if they have not heard about Legendborn at the very least, you are a UNC Chapel Hill graduate with degrees in performance studies and communication, and the author of works that are appearing in, I believe, Our Stories, Our Voices, and the upcoming Star Wars Empire Strikes Back from a certain point of view, which is not out yet, as I recall. But you're here for your first novel, Legendborn, which is from McElderry Books, and so also you're just super awesome, I think, based on what the internet tells me, so...
I'm excited that the internet is saying that Tracy is cool, because it's true, and so is this book. So, first things first, tell us about Legendborn. What is it about? What's the elevator pitch you gave to your agent?
So Legendborn is about a 16-year-old girl named Bree Matthews who's grieving the loss of her mother and decides to infiltrate a secret society because she believes that they may know the truth behind her mother's mysterious death. All is going not so well when they reveal that they are the descendants of the Knights of the Round Table, and her mission gets a lot more dangerous and fun. And that's the book. Dangerous and fun.
I'm very curious about this phrasing, dangerous and fun, given the various events that happen in this book. Dangerous, definitely.
Yeah.
Fun. Interesting.
Yeah.
It is, sure, I'll give you that. It's occasionally pretty fun. But, okay, so let's start with the real big thing here, which is already kind of brought up with the elevator pitch, which is something this book's getting a lot of attention for, is its treatment of Arthurian legend, its different take on it, and one that sort of takes this European/British Isles mythology, but puts it in the perspective of a Black teenager. And so I was curious, what kind of originally inspired you to explore this legend? Like, why Arthur? What's the deal?
Yeah, it's funny. I've had this question asked before, and I always smile because I love saying that I didn't even start with Arthur, because I didn't, and I actually think that that's part of why Legendborn has been received the way it has been. I started with a personal story that created Bree. So Bree is grieving the loss of her mother, starts the book from a place of loss, curiosity, because she doesn't have quite the answer that she wants about what happened there. Something very similar happened to me, and then I lost my mother, and there was a medical answer, but I felt like I didn't have the answer, which I think is pretty common when you lose someone you love. And but I did find out through talking to family members that my mother had lost her own mother at sort of the same age. So there was this like echo effect. And the same thing had happened to my grandmother, as I found out later. So as a writer and as a genre loving writer, of course, I'm like, what is the story there? How could that happen? And that's really the birth of the main character, Bree, was me having this conversation with myself about, what could possibly have created this pattern in my family. And I got to King Arthur because I've always been a fan of King Arthur and the Arthurian legends. I talk about this a lot. The Dark is Rising sequence by Susan Cooper is one of my favorite contemporary fantasy stories ever.
Mine
Um,
too.
I really love it. It was a pivotal discovery of my life when I read that series, and which is based in like this 60s and 70s, but it just I love it. And so Arthur had sort of been hanging around the back of my mind for a while, and I realized when I was asking questions about my own life that I wanted to know what lives and losses get immortalized in legend and which ones get lost to history. And that question was circling. And of course, that led me to what makes certain stories legendary. And that very easily is sort of a quick hop to Arthur, because this is an enduring set of legends around a figure. And once I started realizing that Arthur was even dealing with those same themes of generations and loss and power and death and all of that, the responsibility laid towards the youngest family member, all that stuff is there. So they sort of were talking to each other in my mind pretty quickly after that.
Absolutely. And you kind of skipped straight ahead to the second question that we had, which obviously one of the most potent themes is grief. It's an absolutely inescapable part of Legendborn, and not just for Bree, but for most of the other main characters. Selwyn, obviously, Nick as well. Like, these are creatures, I shouldn't say creatures, these are people that have experienced great loss in their life and are dealing with it in very different ways. So now that you've told us your story of why grief in particular, can you talk a bit about how you more specifically saw it informing the characters of Legendborn?
So yes, in terms of how grief affects everyone else, it bled out into the other characters in ways that surprised me, to be honest. It wasn't until I got towards like maybe, fourth or fifth revision that I realized that other characters were wrestling with, loss in their own way. But I also think that the magic system necessitates a conversation about grief and loss. So when I say the descendants, that the Legendborn are the descendants of the Knights of the Round Table, it's a secret society that's been formed around sort of keeping sacred, keeping control over the bloodlines of the knights that lived 1500 years ago. And to do that, to be in that position, the whole magical structure and all the logistics have to be around power being passed from one generation to the next, and glorifying that in some ways, because the Legendborn are these warriors fighting an ancient magical war, but also acknowledging that there are legacies that get transferred, and the book is very much about like legacy being a complicated term, and that there are different types of legacies and different types of receptions, but they all come from people in our family who have gone and passed on and then left something for us to reckon with. So in some ways it's like every character, especially the Legendborn, are dealing with loss. It's just how does it get framed? It's the same, it's the same sort of concept, but everybody's looking at it from a different angle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've mentioned, right, that this book deals very much with the issue of legacy, and much of Legendborn sort of is handling like the origins of U.S. institutions like UNC Chapel Hill, and other institutions as well, their secret societies, which you'll probably come back to later. But one of the things that you're sort of exploring here is the sort of struggle that the various characters have to deal with in terms of the legacies that they may inherit, or in other cases have to experience. Bree has to experience the legacies and see how they sort of reverberate through time. And so I guess really wanted to talk about like your interest in like the issues that legacies present to us, both sort of on a broad cultural level, but even for the individual, because so much of this book deals with that precise concern.
Yeah. So I went to UNC Chapel Hill, as you said, and I went there for 2 degrees. I worked there after I graduated. And when you go to schools that are just that old, there's a lot of, I mean, with any old institution, but particularly a institution of higher learning, there's a lot of narrative around what it means to be that old. Institutions like to tell stories about themselves. And UNC, you really had one of the first stories that you'll hear is the oldest public school in the country to have graduated students, which it is. And some people just call it the oldest public school in the country. It's, the building that Bree lives in the book was built by enslaved people. It's the oldest public school residential hall in the country. So UNC has all of these, names for itself, stories about itself, about what it means to be the first and what it means to be the oldest and the established and the one leading the charge in terms of higher ed. But it just didn't, you don't hear all the other stuff, which is like, yeah, it was built by enslaved people though. Like it was built in the late 1700s, not long after the Revolutionary War. This wasn't just built, it was built by people who were owned by other people. And we don't talk about those. And I think that the idea of legacy being a story we tell ourselves just as much as it is actually material inheritance is something that has always been super fascinating to me. And when I went to UNC, you're walking in it. A lot of Legendborn is about walking through history, and that legacies are things that can be in the air and can be in your environment as much as they are a physical thing, a material thing, money. In this case, magical abilities. That legacy really is a complicated word in terms of what it means, and also who it impacts, because it's such an elegant word. I think we frame it around sort of a good thing automatically, like this is someone's legacy, like you want to leave behind a legacy. And I think culturally we put this positive sort of spin and this noble spin on it, but it's just not that simple. And I happened to go to UNC at a time when they were really starting to reckon with, sort of formally in the material space of the school, what it meant to memorialize the people who owned slaves, but not memorialize the people who built the actual property that we were all living in, studying on. And I was there when they were raising money for the Unsung Founders Memorial, which is a memorial that I mentioned in the book. I describe in the book pretty carefully. And it's one that is actually in existence at UNC. It's exactly as I've described, except for the location. And it was meant to memorialize and honor the enslaved people who built the school. But it's this really strange thing. And it was funded by and supported by one of the graduating classes. It was a senior class gift. That was their legacy. And it was such a fascinating thing to be a part of, to help bring that into the world at UNC, because you're looking at a graduating class of, gosh, what was it? I want to say 2002, that decided that as seniors, they wanted to leave behind the memory of people who had never been publicly remembered. And that became a memorial at UNC, this really heavy obsidian looking table. And even when I was there helping to raise money for it on behalf of the seniors, you would call their parents and ask if they wanted to donate money to this class gift that their child had nominated. And the parents were like, no. So often we had parents who were like, no, I don't want to do that. Why would we do that? And so, and it, and then it became this, but it's like, it's such a layered thing, because it said, well, your child, Johnny or whomever, wanted to do this. That's what, they wanted to leave behind. But the parents said, well, that's not what I want to support leaving behind. So it's a very long-winded answer, but I feel like legacy was something that just came up and was churned and twisted and turned around so much for me as I was becoming the person who could even begin to write a book like this. And so it sort of makes sense that part of what I'm doing is unpacking it in as many ways as possible in the book.
So I do actually want to follow up on the Unsung Heroes, or Unsung Founders
Mm-hmm.
Memorial, because the final form is pretty complicated unto itself, not just as you talked about now, the process of bringing it into being, which very much ties into, I think, a lot of moments in this book, specifically Bree's experiences with parents,
Mm-hmm.
which were so much fun to read. Anyway, but I've heard that there's differing opinions on the effect of the Unsung Founders Memorial, which features enslaved people holding up this table and obviously trying to denote that they are the foundation of the school, but also still is enslaved people holding up a table for primarily white students to sit around. So I'm curious about that kind of sort of problematic framing of something that is meant to be positive, but because we're talking about legacy, something that is meant to be positive, but in final form isn't necessarily going to convey the message the same way, especially to different people.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that when I was an undergrad when I was doing some of the fundraising for that, and I will say that I really, as it was described to us, it really seemed like a lovely thing, that it was going to be a place where one could sit and contemplate. And I think that really was the original intention. I don't have the inscription in front of me, but there is an inscription around the table. You sort of have to walk around it to read it. And I think it is meant to be a place to sort of meditate on the history of the school. But as you said, the actual embodied effect is that it's a table that you sit on, and what do you do at tables? You tend to put stuff on them. So you're like actually literally loading down the carved figures who are holding something up. And I've heard stories of people witnessing, generally what the stories are is that they're witnessing white mothers changing their children's diapers on it, like that it has been used from anything from lunch to studying to diaper changing to, and then of course it's been vandalized at least once or twice. So I do, in my mind, and I look back and I think about, what are you communicating, and the fact that they're still laboring is a pretty clear flag that, I think that there's something iffy about it. Because you think about memorials, in some ways I think UNC felt like in the institution, or the people who helped lead the charge, that they were doing a little bit of counterbalance. They were doing a little bit of like, well, we know we have Silent Sam, which is a statue that I engage with in the book by not calling it. We know we have that. We know we have, whole buildings that are named after Klan members or whatever. And then we're going to bring in this, and that's going to be, we're going to sort of tip the scales by having something permanent sit here that reflects that. Well, it's all black. I'm not really 100% sure that it communicates what you want if you have something that is, like sort of a void of color in that way. And it's also compared to other things that are marble or, this amazing white brick or whatever. And so, and then the people that you see on campuses generally who are, slaveholders, they're just sort of standing triumphantly, sitting in nice chairs. Silent Sam was holding a gun. I mean, you have these sort of power poses, right? And then you have other people who are still working. Like it communicates this sort of Atlas type vibe as well. It's very strange. So I think they're moving the memorial. I talked to somebody on campus earlier this spring, and I think they're actually voting to move it. And I don't know if they're going to elevate it or what, but I think the university has realized that the placement of it does not condone the type of reverential mood that they were hoping for. And also with the vandal, I think they're trying to get it to a point where it can't be as easily vandalized. But yeah, when I go there now, well, last time I went, it was cordoned off. They had, I think, police tape or something basically around it, so you couldn't even sit. So then it just became, well, like, what is this now? I can't get close to it. I can't sit at the table. I can't get close enough to read this inscription because it's been so under, duress, basically, because they're worried that people are going to damage it. So it just, I was there when the intentions were stated, and yet the more and more I thought about it, and I communicate this in the book, the more I'm like, this ain't it, I don't think this ain't it.
I did pull up the inscription. Folks can find the Unsung Founders Memorial. There's a wiki page, and UNC has a page about it, I believe, as well. But the inscription reads, "The class of 2002 honors the university's unsung founders, the people of color, bond and free, who helped build the Carolina that we cherish today."
It's a lovely inscription, you know, like it, you know, the intentions are there, but as with anything with social justice or trying to address historical wrongs, intentions really don't take you very far. And it's the,
Yeah.
you know, it's the effect and the consequences and the impact that on other people and in material world that actually matter. So I'm hoping that this plan to move that I've heard about is sort of taking that into account, in which case I would be quite impressed that UNC was paying attention, that, hey, you know, we had these intentions, but it's actually not playing out how we want.
I think one of the things too is that you're not just dealing with the legacy of that as it affects Black people, although obviously that is very much centered in Legendborn, clearly, as it should be. But as with the grief, the legacy is also poisoning the white characters in a very clear way in terms of, you know, why they are grieving themselves and loss and all sorts of other issues that I'm trying not to spoil. It's not directly poison, but wow, okay.
But yeah, it affects them for sure. There are negative consequences. I mean, I think the stories we tell ourselves and then the rules that get made around upholding those stories, I think are always something that we should be examining. And I think that's very much part of what's happened to the other characters in the book is like there's been a construction, a mythology based, in this case, it's not really a mythology, it's a legend, but the idea of sort of like more than a story, I'll say. It's a living, breathing sort of container that helps elevate their lives and their families, and how that actually can be very easily tipped over into sort of the dark side, and result in consequences that, you know, you've got to face, that you actually have now trapped yourself in, because of the nature of the story. And so I think that's a lot of what Legendborn is getting at too, is that it's so easy for all of us, for anyone to trap themselves in a story they tell, especially if you're telling it for the wrong reasons. And I would say the wrong reason for the Legendborn is that, you know, over time, maybe the intention was pure, but at some point power corrupts. And then the stories get told just to perpetuate the power control rather than perhaps, you know, something as benign as, you know, we're here to be honorable people. It's less about that and more about, you know, consolidation of power. And all of that all of that mythologizing is something that, you know, America is very good at.
We really are.
That leads me basically to my next question. So obviously you deal pretty directly with the systemic and built-in cultural systems of racism on a variety of levels, right? Like from UNC down to like directly on individual members of a family. But one of the ways that this is introduced to us is through all of the microaggressions that Bree experiences. Sometimes it's something that someone says innocently, and sometimes obviously very deliberately. So I was curious if you could talk about how you wanted to explore Bree's relationship with bigotry and prejudice through those microaggressions, and obviously the importance of that to, you know, you and the book in general.
You know, I really, really wanted to write a contemporary fantasy story that asked hard questions and challenged itself to treat both the fantasy elements and the contemporary elements the same, and press on them, lean on them equally, and as subgenres within this, you know, that make up this subgenre of fantasy. And it really, that was one of my missions, was because I just don't see a lot of fantasies that actually deal with racism. Their fantasy has been sort of well known for having proxies for racism. So you'll have like the people who have like the blue skin, or, you know, so-and-so's blood is a different color, or, you know, X-Men, and I love the X-Men, you know, the mutants are a proxy for racism. Actually, they're you know, and what I really and I'm not the only one. I know other authors of color, in particular Black authors, are just like, yeah, but the problem with that is that, a mutant who doesn't have control over their powers is dangerous, and like actually is a walking, living weapon without, especially when they first manifest, which is sort of the actual trope of X-Men. It's like when a mutant first manifests their powers, they might actually hurt you or kill themselves or others, right? And Black people are not walking weapons. So
Right.
you can't make those equivalences, like they don't actually work. And so I said, well, what if we just actually set this in the real world? Contemporary fantasy is my favorite subgenre to write in. It's the one I'm drawn to most as a reader. And what if we actually had all of that in the page? And so instead of having, just a stand-in for racism, we actually had racism. And we actually had a protagonist dealing with how things are.
That's a wild
I know,
thought.
but but it's actually like legit revolutionary when you look at, contemporary fantasy.
Yeah.
Like, how often do we see this? And so I wanted to do that, and that's a long introduction to saying that, yeah, Bree dealing with microaggressions, it was the only way that I could stay true to that mission, is that she was going to have this experience. When you can't tell a story about the descendants of the Knights of the Round Table coming from, a Western Europe origin story, and have part of the power being controlling their bloodlines to such a degree that they have people who are direct, sort of descendants they can track from over, 15 centuries. You can't tell that story and have a Black girl at the center and not have microaggressions come up, particularly in the South. It would be dishonest of me. One thing I can say about the microaggressions is that I realize that with all the things that I'm making up, all of the fantasy stuff that I am making up, there were certain things in this book that had to stay true and had to be historically accurate. So there's like 2 or 3 things about UNC that I changed. I mentioned them by name in the author's note of the book. Everything else is the same. And with Bree's microaggressions, all of those were drawn from experiences I had myself. So I didn't have them over the course of like 3 weeks, the way that Bree's life is pretty compressed and dense, and there's a lot going on. But I did have all of them. I have had all of them as a young person. And so it was really important to me that microaggressions get represented from a factual place, because I didn't want anyone to say, well, this is just all made up, or like, this didn't really happen. I needed to be able to say on the other side, actually, that part of the story is extremely true to life. That's where the contemporary part is pulling no punches. And that those things really did happen, and they have to come from. A friend of mine read an earlier draft, and she's a Black woman, and she was like, these have to come from people that we like and people we don't like. Like, you can't have just the bad white people, have these microaggressions, commit these microaggressions. You actually have to have it happen across the board, because that's the experience, right? And I was like, you're right. You're totally right. I've had plenty of friends, people I love, good friends, who don't even realize that that's what's happening. And that's part of the story that Bree is living in, right? Is that we're in her head and we're seeing how they affect her negatively in every case, but it's difference between someone who she can talk to about it and someone she can't even address that they've just done this to her, and someone who's doing it on purpose, and so she's never going to be able to like change their mind in one conversation.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I thought what was especially interesting about that was that you are, while dealing with both the unintentional and intentional microaggressions from both good people, quote unquote good people, and quote unquote bad people, you're also dealing with that microaggressions against some other characters. Like, you contrast Bree's experiences with characters like Greer, Sarah, and even Whitty. So can you talk a little bit about why you framed that contrast the way that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just needed to show that tools of, systems of power in this book, and particularly goes back to that contemporary fantasy thing, is that systems of power come in all different shapes and sizes, and they can be magical, but they can also be around race and gender and class and all these things. And I guess I just, really felt compelled to put my foot on the gas on all of them and to say, like, these things don't happen in a vacuum. I couldn't have told a story where it was just Bree who was getting who's being called out as different or being treated differently, because that would also be dishonest, right? But I also needed to show how that intersected with her, because intersectionality is a thing. And, she's living at the intersection of multiple identities, and that does change things for her in a way that it really doesn't affect other people. So with Greer, they talk about their experience, but they articulate actually that they're white. And so they know that they have experiences that are negative, but there is a shield, a privilege shield, that has limited when they hear it, if those comments are said directly to their face. And so I wanted to sort of show that intersectionality exists, and how that even is going to complicate Bree's mission. And the thing that what's interesting is I could probably talk at length, and I am talking at length about all of the racism and the microaggressions and all of the sort of identity oppression that happens in the book. But a lot of what I wanted to do is show that these types of tools of oppression, these types of micro and macroaggressions, are really just things that get in people's way. And Bree's not there to try and show the order that they've got racist systems. Like, she's not there to show people that they don't treat women correctly. Like, she's not there for any of that. She's there to find out what happened to her mother. It just so happens that in a modern day society, in our world, racism is in the air, and it's an environmental antagonist that will get in your way whenever you're just trying to do your job. And that's really, there was something I kept in the back of my mind, is that I wanted racism to be a level of antagonism that is ever present, could pop up at any time, and is something that Bree has to deal with on her way to the rest of her life. And that is exactly how it feels. Like, there are days I don't wake up thinking I'm Black today. I wake up thinking I'm Tracy, and then someone reminds me that I'm different than they are. Like, and I'm like, oh, great, thank you for that. Or like, now my job is harder. Or, oh, there's this other thing that because you have a belief, now I have to work a little bit harder. Like, and that's really the unfortunate experience of racism. And is something that I wanted to show, because her mission, again, has nothing to do with all that stuff, but it does change her mission.
Yeah. One thing that was, as you were talking about this, there's this moment in the book that just, for whatever reason, of all of the different things that Bree experiences on this particular issue, the moment when she's at one of the meetings and basically another character says, oh, this is the most diverse meeting we had, and then like stares straight at her, that like stood out to me so much. I kept thinking about that moment over and over, of just like, because I'd never considered that maybe saying that would potentially make something be very uncomfortable for a bunch of people, and yet that's sort of how Bree immediately takes it, of like, oh, I see exactly what you're doing right now. And it just, for some reason, that scene just like, it just jabs me. It just keeps getting me. So really, this is me saying good job.
Good. Yeah. I mean, those are the moments that you accumulate them over and over again. And you're just like, I am really just trying to do my thing. And yet there are people who can't stop talking about or rewarding themselves for my presence in their space. And that is an awful feeling, that someone is like, they've just been able to pat themselves on the back because they allowed you in their house. Like, how demeaning that feels.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that, just little things that Bree gets this sense of, I don't really belong here, and you're kind of telling me that I don't belong here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you did make me think too, like, this ties into grief, because in a way, at the very beginning, we have this concept of the after Bree, as Bree's dealing with the grief of the loss of her mother. But she also has these things like everybody wants to say, like, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. There's all these like repeated phrases we say. And from Bree's perspective, that is so hard for her to handle, because they are so repeated. They're things that she's constantly having thrust at her. And so it actually becomes a bit of a relief at one moment when she meets someone who doesn't fall into the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really interesting to see, because I think most everybody does eventually lose someone, but those are the things that, like, until it's happened, you don't always think about how the phrases and words you say might just be like almost instinctual, and you're not really thinking about the effect they might have on the other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's, on some level, it's an impossible situation, because if you haven't, like you said, if you haven't experienced that, or you haven't experienced it recently, or whatever, even if you have, knowing the right thing to say to a grieving person is just, it's impossible. There is no single right answer. But I do think that there is for Bree, what she's picking up on is that there are social answers. And there are
Right.
social responses, and we're sort of like programmed to say certain things. And typically, I feel like it's a good rule of thumb that's like, if you are saying something you saw on a Lifetime movie, and that's the first thing and the only thing that you can think of, like maybe that's, watch your first instinct, because we are programmed to respond in certain ways about grief. And I think Bree's picking up on that she's being called she's getting called to the sort of the floor for this performative ritual. And she's like, I don't really want to be there, but people keep trying to call me into it and like invite me to play this back and forth. And she's like, I don't want to do that. And I think that is something that lots of people can, that can be applied to a lot of different situations, but definitely for grief. I don't know, when I was in the fresh parts of grief, I would just be amazed. It's almost like I was watching other people go through this dance, and it didn't really matter even what I said sometimes. They just had this like step-by-step process that they needed to go to, the things they needed to say and do. And I would just be like, who are you doing this for? Is this for me? Like, who is that for? Is that just because you saw that on a TV show, or, is that just
Hallmark
exactly,
cards.
yeah, or it's like, did someone say that to you? Did it actually make you feel better? Goodness. There was this sort of observational quality that I had where I was distanced and sort of outside of myself.
Well, and that's kind of one of the things that is functioning in this, as you say, with the saying, this is the most diverse room that we've had and whatnot, is that people are saying things to make themselves comfortable with the situation, not the person who actually needs to be comfortable with the situation.
Yeah, it's also a reminder too, like when you say that this is the most diverse room we've had, it's like, you've had this room's been used a lot. It's taking you till now? Like
1,500 years.
Yeah. And they're like, and it's like one person, and they're so, someone's so self-congratulatory. So then it just becomes like, even if you did have the space and the power to say something back, like you would just be like, now you're the ass, right? Like now you're the person who's like, okay, but I got to dunk on you, because that is not an achievement. I know you feel like you've achieved something, but it's horrible. Like you haven't. And so, comments like that put you in such a weird position, especially when they're made publicly. And I think,
oh yeah,
yeah.
Well, like specifically in that case, she clearly wasn't trying to pat herself on the back for it being diverse. It was a direct insult to Bree for even being in this space.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I do think, like, in that moment, this is Tor. I do think in that moment there's a clout collection moment happening.
Yeah.
Right. Because then it's like, if you say it out loud and then you get to and then there's applause, there's this other thing where you get to be able to be the person who have said that.
Right.
And I do think there's a lot of performative allyship that can look like that, where it's like,
yes.
Okay, if you weren't going to say it out loud, then maybe I could interpret this differently. But the fact that you put it out on the timeline, or the fact that you made a blog post about it or whatever, like the fact that you made it very, very public means that you were talking to other white people, probably not just me, So
speaking of being in white spaces, it's very important in this, and speaking to people who might be better equipped to know what language to talk to somebody grieving. And that's the situations in which Bree is with other Black women, specifically with her therapist and with Mariah. And those become sort of decompression chambers, so to speak, but also anchors for her in a different space. Can you talk a little bit about how that functions, both for Bree and within the larger context of the novel?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I wanted to, like you said, is have a decompression space, is just have a space where the reader could feel with Bree that she didn't have to be as vigilant. or, in a position of sort of bracing for impact at all times. And, there's a lot of talk about safe spaces and what those mean. And you've heard people talk about those before. And I think people just don't really understand that it's not that you want to be protected from harm. It's that you can let your guard down. And that is about a function that you can release, not so much about being safe from someone saying something that hurts your feelings or whatever. And when you are on guard all the time, it's exhausting. It's completely exhausting. I mean, if nothing else, I hope this book, when it comes to racism, communicates how exhausting it is. Like, it's just like, you're just like, oh my gosh, here again, or like, I thought I was amongst friends, but now I have to explain, don't touch my hair, or whatever. And to be able to go to spaces where you don't have to do that is incredibly rewarding. And I know that's particularly, I'm speaking from my experience, but that's true for many marginalized folks who can feel that sort of release in their chest when they're around people where they don't have to worry as much about their identity being called into discussion or debated or criticized or whatever.
Yeah, another side to this, I was thinking as you're mentioning the way that you're treated in certain spaces. Nick as another character that kind of, in a different way, but experiences this as well because of his, and we won't say a whole lot about what his role exactly is. He's just handsome. That's really his role.
It is. He's cute.
But he has these moments where he's entering into these spaces, where the magic and stuff is happening, and it's clear that he's not comfortable because he fulfills a specific role within that space that comes with enormous pressures.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens with a number of different characters in different ways, but you kind of explore that same thing in just a slightly different way with these other characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, some of that's just, YA is so wonderful for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of boundaries you can push at in YA. I think that YA is doing incredible work around identity and incredible subversive work even around typical sort of commonly published fictional stories about what it means to be a person in the world. What I love about it is that when you center teen or young adult protagonists, you can really show what it's like to be figuring yourself out under pressure.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is one of the hallmarks, at least from my experience of being a teenager or a young person, is like you're literally figuring out who you are under immense pressure sometimes, under people who have different expectations of what you can and can't do. And you are also figuring out what you can and can't do and what you're willing to do that isn't endorsed by an adult in your life, because that may be the first time that you've been able to do that. So I do love that all of that is happening for these characters. But of course, because it's YA fantasy, I say of course, it's not necessarily given, but a lot of YA fantasy will have teenagers in a position of power, that they have some sort of important role because they're centered in the story. And so with the Legendborn, they are pretty powerful. Like they're described as being, in terms of the hierarchy of the order of the secret society, they're pretty high up, and there are only a few people that they answer to. And so I think having teenagers go through all that stuff, but then having them have lots of power and impact, and then showing where they have none, is like part of the fun for me from a craft perspective.
I feel like you just gave a synopsis of Legendborn without ever like mentioning, what it's actually about, which was brilliant. Like that idea of characters finding out who they are, which yes, is, definitely a function of YA, but as Sean and I when we first connected today on our call, Sean was like, this book is such a roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, because it's like one chapter after another of not just Bree finding out who she really is, but Selwyn and Nick and so many of the other characters, but particularly those three. And like, we haven't even mentioned Selwyn yet. And oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
If this was not a YA, I'm definitely into the bad boys. Let's just...
Selwyn is, I sometimes wonder if he might be my greatest creation, if I've peaked already as a writer.
Oh my goodness!
Because there are so many people who are just like, oh my gosh, Selwyn. And I feel like I made him in a lab in my mind. And then it just so happens that the output is this character that so many different people have just attached themselves to, and I love it. I mean, as a fangirl, I love characters like that too, right? So I knew I may have gone into the lab with a little bit of an idea of what I wanted to come out, but
I mean, let's just say that there's a little bit of Lucas in Selwyn, I think.
Yeah, a little bit.
And...
yeah. A little bit. A little bit of seaQuest Lucas. I mean, I've comped him to like, he's a little low-key, he's a little like young Sherlock, he's a little Damon Salvatore from the Vampire Diaries. Like he's a mixture of all three of those in like the best possible way. He's also a little tiny Zuko. Like he's got like so much going on, all the best parts.
Yeah, and his discovery, like I feel like Bree at the beginning, has already started that journey of self-discovery but she's, very much like partitioned herself off from it, with the before Bree and the after Bree, and then has so many reveals that she's like, oh, okay, well, there we go. I guess I didn't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
Selwyn is very firm in who he is when the book starts.
Yes.
And you first meet him.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, slight spoilers. All of that is thrown out the window. And he's forced to contend with it. And to an extent that happens to Nick as well, who's like, I know who I am, but I rejected it. Selwyn has accepted it as this is exactly who I am. And both of them have moments of, whoa.
It's just so we're being really clear. Jen is talking about the fact that Sel finds out that he is the lost member of New Kids on the Block.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
He's the one. He was a character that was discarded from an early pilot of seaQuest, and then he's actually back later. But like from an authorial standpoint, what makes a book in a universe like the Legendborn universe really have legs is that every character has an arc. And I don't know who said it, but there's this idea that your secondary and tertiary characters don't know they're not the main character. And they, write them as though they are the main character of their story because they are. And that's sort of true and treat them that way. And for me, I knew that I needed both of the boys, both Nick and Sel, to have their own arc. Their relationship also had to have its own arc.
Yeah.
I really was very adamant, I think, from the beginning that if I was going to include any sort of hint of a love triangle, and it's not quite there in this book, but I talk about it enough that I feel like I could say that. But that
it's close enough.
Yeah, it's close enough. It's close. But that they couldn't be at each other's throats because of Bree. I didn't want that's a very common setup for a love triangle in this, particularly a YA book, and I didn't want that. I was like, okay, well, that's not going to be their relationship. They're going to have tensions that have started way before Bree shows up, that have nothing to do with Bree, and will progress even around her and through her, but not necessarily because of her. So Nick and Selwyn have an arc. William, I think, has the beginnings of an arc. I think. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that in book 2 he continues on and we see more of William. We see more of everybody, but Alice, Bree's best friend, has an arc. There's just this there's development, I think, for all these characters, and off the page we even, I think, see some growth happening with other characters. Like Bree's dad, even, I think, has like a very small, his arc is not as dramatic perhaps, but it is there.
Well, it's a parental arc for sure. Like as a parent of 2 older teenagers,
Shadowborn. You can be honest, they're Shadowborn.
I mean, that's not unlikely, actually. I mean, let's just put it anyway. His arc was very familiar to me. As like sort of that acceptance path, but he's also going to go through some other things. I mean, obviously, I mean, he's got a lot to go through. Parents have a lot to go through.
Yeah, yeah, especially the parent who's left behind in a situation like that. So yeah, I just, and I don't, you may have been getting to that point, but like, yeah, I do think they all have arcs and things to discover, and that's what keeps I- that to me, as someone who, like I said, has been a lifelong fangirl, to me, that's what keeps a universe alive in my mind, is that I feel like the other characters, I've watched them grow, and off the page, when the main character's not there, I feel like they're still alive and they still have a whole perspective they could do. I don't think this is when I announce that I'm going to write an entire book of like Selwyn's POV. Like, I don't know that I'm going to do like a Stephanie Meyer, although I could. But that having space in your story for that to
Yeah.
have to be believable is so important to creating a compelling book.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
With an ensemble, at least.
Yeah, and we're now at like the 45-50 minute mark, and I still have like 10,000 more questions. So
Okay.
this is like progressing beautifully. I'm just saying.
Tracy's like, oh, just fine. Yeah, just go.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
So I did want to talk about magic because there's a lot of it in this book. It is a fantasy, and so it features people doing magic things, and it features monstrous creatures, and basically magic sword arms and things like that. Basically everything that a magic lover could want in life. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you kind of were trying to incorporate the types of magic, especially specifically with like the Legendborn, which we don't spoil other elements, but the Legendborn and the Merlins and all of these kind of unique characters, and they're what they refer to as aether magic, which is really interesting and also creepy and scary at times. And it gets incorporated into the characters, into the story. It becomes a huge part of the first, I don't know, like 150 pages of the book. It's like very central. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about like where you were drawing it from and sort of exploring those things and how they relate to the characters.
Yeah, so I really wanted there to be a magic system that supported a realistic situation where characters could be descended from the Knights of the Round Table. And so the magic system, a lot of the complexities of the magic system I built because of trying to make it realistic, and the rules and the magic and like how could things be underground for that long. And in contemporary fantasy and also in urban fantasy, which is sort of its sister subgenre, the idea of magic that only certain people can see is very common, right? Because we have to be able to explain why magic is not something that everyone at large knows in a closed world magical story, which is what Legendborn is. It's closed world in that like not everybody knows about it, whereas open world is like everybody knows the vampires exist, and so with this book, I really had to come up with systems that would allow for the Legendborn to operate in secret and be sort of covert. But then also there had to be a tipping point where if things escalated, then they would impact humans who didn't know anything about the world. And so one of the ways I did that was to talk about a spell being what allowed them to have the abilities that they had, and creating a story around what happened 1500 years ago that was strong enough that it could survive to the modern day. This is where I drew a little bit on Susan Cooper, because that happens in The Dark is Rising. There are things that the magic users can see that other people can't see, and then there's, how do they persist that long? And so contemporary fantasy actually helps you build magic systems just by the nature of it being magic in a modern day world. Because you just have to ask yourself, what about the world would change or be different for me to allow this to happen? Believably, right? Because when you have second world fantasy, you have the reader is hopping along with you into a completely different circumstance where they don't necessarily have expectations about how the magic is seen or used. And with the magic that the Legendborn use, they are able to pull. I go back and forth with ether and aether. I'm gonna go with ether right now, but like I totally said aether for 2 years. With the magic they pull from the air, ether is a resource that's pulled, that's in the air. It's invisible to the sort of mundane human eye, and then it can be pulled, into existence and then formed by some people into weapons or constructs, is what they're called in the book. And so the Legendborn can pull those into weapons or shields or other devices or other things. And I really love the flexibility of that. I love the visualness of it. I used to work in video game production, so I love the idea, the visual of something coalescing out of the air and becoming something that the wielder wanted it to become.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, my secret hope is that, like, of course, it gets like adapted into a television show, and then we get to see that, because I feel like it would be so pretty,
Yeah.
and just fun, But also, I needed to have a way to explain why they didn't have to carry around weapons all the time, because they're college students.
Right.
It's like they can't just like they can have some weapons that are sort of metal weapons or material weapons, but they needed to be able to draw on something more powerful than that if they came across a demon. And one of the ways that I could do that is if the magic was always around them, but they didn't always activate it to create something.
I do have a question about this. If you were hungry, could you form it into a sandwich?
I think how do I answer this? Certain beings could. That's my answer.
Oh wow, I was okay.
Yeah. I don't know that it would be. I don't think it fulfills the same purpose as like bologna. Like, I don't think it like gives you like food power, but like I do think that there are beings who do consume ether in the book and could. Yeah.
Ooh, that's fun.
Yeah, no spoilers.
No spoilers.
But
yeah.
Well, I don't think it's a huge spoiler that Selwyn has an interesting relationship with it. I don't want to joke about it, as we mentioned beforehand, but Selwyn definitely is consuming it to a degree.
Yeah, he's using it. It affects his body differently because Merlins have a stronger affinity with ether, and so they are using it. I mean, Merlins are the only characters that can form anything with ether,
right? For reasons which we will not mention at this time.
because that's why they're Merlins. But but the other characters can only form like specific weapons related to their knight.
That's really cool though.
I think so too.
I think that's really cool is when you start to like piece together a lot of the magic, you have all of like the good hallmarks of a magic system, because it's got its limitations, it has its effects, both for their benefit and potential also harm, right? Because it kind of can come both ways, and it's really really nice to see that in a YA fantasy, because I just like it. That's really what it comes down to. I realize that's not a clever comment. It's just that I think it really works and makes for a very interesting experience, especially as Bree's sort of like discovering all of this stuff and is giving us this very unique perspective on it.
Yeah, and it's hard to communicate that. As a writer, I had to decide like how to sort of drip the information because Bree's the outsider, so she's our self-insert character. How does she stumble upon, a little bit more information about how the magic works? How much can she be told versus how much do we and she, do we learn by her witnessing it and sort of gathering the information? Yeah. It's difficult to do, but and I hope I did an okay job. But I also realized that I was setting up a magic system that I was going to then use for the next book. So I'm really excited about in the sequel just using it, because it took like 1.5 years to create this magic system.
That's awesome.
I mean, whiteboards all over my house. Like spreadsheets with multiple sheets and tabs, color coding. I mean, like, I really spent a lot of time on it. And now I get to sort of reap the rewards as the creator and just sort of play with it and maximize it. Because, of course, it's a sequel, so everything has to be, bigger, and magic has to it has to build on itself. And so now I've got so much to play with. It took a really, really long time to come up with something that, and then stress test it and be able to make sure that it could carry a whole universe and a whole series.
Right, because
this writing problem, like, the info dump problem, it's sort of like, do you go full Turkish Star Wars or do you not go that route? And most people have not seen Turkish Star Wars, so Tracy, I will let you know that the Turkish Star Wars problem is that it opens with like a 10-minute narration of what has happened for the last bazillion years, and it's almost impossible to follow because they're basically describing like massive events that have taken place for centuries in a fairly compressed amount of time, so that when the movie actually starts, it's just like a guy staring at you doing ninja kicks, and you're like, how did we get here?
Yeah, but then it spends the rest of the movie not explaining anything at all, so you have to, like, perform guesswork.
Right.
Based on the 10-minute opening spiel that made no sense in the first place. It's something.
It's so hard, and like in this book, we have two sort of information characters that, like, they generally, when you meet them, they're going to give you no information. And one of those is William, and I feel like my answer to being like, okay, William is really about to just lay a whole bunch of information on Bree, and I'm gonna try and make it so it's been telegraphed for the previous chapters that we're about to learn something, and that I'm going to try and make it so that it's earned, but also I'm going to put it in a nice package, which is William, who's a wonderful character.
The best package!
He's wonderful. And he's like another character that a lot of people have said that they love, and it makes me so happy because William, I think, deserves everything. I feel like really proud of him as a character.
That's so sweet.
I think we're coming up towards the end. And I know you've said that it's very hard not to give spoilers, so I'm not going to ask you to give spoilers. I'm going to ask you to somehow convey to people that there is so much more without giving spoilers.
Yeah, I can do that for sure.
Excellent.
Yes, I can do that. I can rise to the challenge. So, Legendborn is not just about one character's journey towards finding out the truth of something that happened in the past. It's very much about figuring out where histories of multiple people, multiple lives, multiple generations intersect, because they do. And even in our real world, I think we are still wrestling with and wrangling with the idea that that histories intersect, and that there are multiple versions of it and multiple perspectives. And this book is definitely about personal history, community history, social history, and how all of those things intersect to create legends, but also mysteries and sometimes power.
That was the most clever workaround.
Good job.
Oh, well done. Well done.
All right, so we're coming to closeout time, which means I want to end with one more very serious question, which is actually just a silly question. And it is the reason that I'm pretty sure it's the reason that this interview came about, because we were tweeting at one another about this television show that both you and Jen have seen and adore. And that show is seaQuest. And folks may remember that's the one with the dolphin. And if you don't remember it, you can watch it right now on Peacock. But I want to know, Tracy, what's the why do you love it so much? What's the deal?
I love seaQuest so much because it is, in many ways, the embodiment of a bottle episode, because they're literally trapped on a submarine. And the episodes where they don't leave the sub are just like bottle episode-rific, and I just love that. I also really adore the motley band working together to like be the like pirates, but also like the uniformed pirates working for good type vibe that is happening in seaQuest. I think that is really lovely, and I like that it's near future. It's not too far in the future. It's near future, so there's recognizable technology paired with technology that was supposed to be super advanced, and that's just usually fun. And plus, Jonathan Brandis, who really had my heart for most of my youth.
Yes, indeed.
These are the reasons.
Those are perfectly good reasons. I like it.
The best reasons.
All right, Tracy. So if folks want to find you and your work, where's the best places to go?
Sure. I am at tracydeonn.com. That's TracyDeonn. And on Instagram and Twitter, I am at Tracy Deonn.
So is there anything that any work or any events that you might be attending, say from late October on, that you might want folks to know about?
Right now, I don't think I have anything confirmed that I can announce. I am doing I've done a couple other podcasts. I'm doing a new podcast called Dreaming in the Dark that's about fantasy and genre from the perspective of Black female readers and Black readers. So that will be airing probably in that time range. And that's going to be kind of cool. I like supporting, they're brand new. I like to support brand new podcasts. In terms of events, I'll try and keep them public on my Instagram. I've got a couple of events in mid-October, but not late. But I'm always getting invited to new things. So I'll probably, as long as you follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you'll see.
Perfect.
Yeah, because, you know, the book has been incredibly successful. So it makes sense that suddenly everybody's like, Tracy, you're brilliant. Please come on our show.
I'm really excited to see like where we go in terms of like 2-3 months from now, and if we'll be then having just tons of spoilery conversations. That's my dream.
I mean,
I
yes,
hope so.
yes. Oh, I want all the spoilery conversations. Okay,
calm down.
But
it's
not
okay.
right now.
It's
sorry.
Okay. All right, we gotta end this podcast at some point, and so thank you so much, Tracy, for coming on the show with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Oh.
Aww.
Feels all warm and fuzzy inside.
She likes us. She really likes us.
And as always, if you'd like to support us, you can find us in all kinds of places. We have a website, skiffingfanty.com, and a newsletter run by Stephen Geigen Miller at skiffingfanty.com/newsletter. Twitter at skiffingfanty. We also have an Instagram now at skiffingfanty, correct, Jen?
Yes, Instagram.com/skiffingfanty.
Correct. And then we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/skiffingfanty, Facebook at facebook.com/skiffingfanty. This is a trend. And you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/skiffingfanty. And beyond that, you know, it's been nice going this long with not needing to wear professional clothes, so I can wear shorty shorts and look like an 80s boy.
I approve.
Same.
Awesome. And on that note, awkward ending and scene. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.